Hello, welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a little bit. Welcome to NMWA xChange. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for NMWA xChange, Curator's Choice Recent Acquisitions. My name is Gayoso. I'm the Senior Educator at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and NMWA xChange is a spin-off of the award-winning pandemic live stream series, BMA NMWA. Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. We see the numbers ticking up and we're glad to have some attendees with us. As always, we have enabled the live transcription, which you can show or hide by clicking on the CC button in Zoom. You are also free to add questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will do our best to address those as we go through the program today. For those of you who didn't join us last month, we spoke with Korean-American illustrator and writer Robin Ha, who discussed her two most recently published books, a graphic novel memoir of her immigration story titled Almost American Girl, and her New York Times bestselling cookbook, Cook Korean, a comic book with recipes. If you missed the show, you can watch it on the museum's YouTube channel, and I will add the link in the chat in just a few seconds. If you're new to the show, each month hosts from NMWA are joined by special guests to center women creatives. We consider topics relevant to our world and offer insight into collaborations NMWA is fostering while its building is closed for renovation. During this time of change, we are excited to exchange ideas with our guests and viewers. My co-host today is Ginny Treanor, NMWA's Associate Curator. Hey, Ginny.
Hello, Addie. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm really excited to bring on today two of our wonderful colleagues who are going to help us chat about recent acquisitions for the collection. That is NMWA Assistant Curator Orin Zahra and our wonderful exhibitions coordinator, Hannah Shambroom. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hi.
It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. I meant to tell you that before we jumped on, that I really appreciate you guys joining us, and it's always fun to chat with you guys. And I miss seeing everybody in person.
Yeah, and it's great to come together to talk about works in the collection. We don't get to do that so much anymore.
Yeah, no, it's true. So as Addie mentioned, the museum is still closed for renovation. We are looking forward to our reopening in the fall of 2023. But we are still very much working every day, and part of our responsibilities as the curatorial team are to acquire works for the collection. And this is a process that all museums go through, right? It's a museum's responsibility to collect and preserve artworks, and that's what we do. And so we wanted to highlight just a few. And it's really just a handful of the hundreds of works that we've acquired over the past 2 to 3 years. But we wanted to highlight a few of them that give you an idea of the scope of what we acquire for the collection, and introduce you maybe to some new artists that you may not be familiar with. And so the first kind of group of things, the first two things that we'll be discussing are from the collection of our founder, Wilhelmina Cole Holliday. And as many of you may know, she passed away last year at the age of 96. She and her husband, Wallace Holliday, started the museum. It opened in 1987. And they had been collecting art by women at that point for well over a decade, and they gifted a large portion of their collection to the museum, and that really became like the core of NMWA's collection for a very long time. Upon her passing, the museum has been gifted an additional really treasure trove of works, and we're going to highlight just a few of those for you today. Mrs. Holliday's impact and contributions to the collections really cannot be overstated. I think there are probably 400 some odd works that were donated by her and her family to the museum. And just to give you an idea, our collection is probably hovering around 6,000 objects at this point. So it's a fairly sizable chunk of the collection that comes directly from the holidays. So the first work that we will be discussing is a fabulous, fabulous painting that I'm going to let Orin tell you about because she is the 19th century French expert here. So Orin, take it away.
Thanks, Ginny. And this painting is by Eva Gonzalez. It's a beautiful painting. Now, I did not have the pleasure of seeing it in the residence of Mrs. Holliday, but as I hear it, it was one of the first things that you saw when you entered the home, and it had such a presence on anyone in that space. And knowing what I know about Gonzalez and the painting, I have no doubt that it was really this sort of beautiful sort of welcome into her home. Gonzalez was a 19th century French painter. You may or may not have heard of her. There isn't a whole lot of scholarship on her, unfortunately, and really not much of anything written on this particular painting, which is just a really gorgeous, stunning example of her whole body of work. She ran in the same circles as the Impressionist artists in Paris, again in the 19th century, but she really has not been discussed in the same vein as, let's say, Mary Cassatt or Bertha Morisot, and definitely much less than her male peers and contemporaries from that movement. Gonzalez studied with Edouard Manet, who you may know as, the reluctant father of Impressionism. He was major artist associated with the movement. He didn't take on a lot of students, but he did take on Eva Gonzalez as his only formal student. And it's sort of an annoyance for art historians like me that she is so often discussed as Manet's student, as is the story for so many women artists, right? They're discussed in relation to a male partner or a male relative, or in this case, a teacher. And she did, in her writings, very openly admire Manet as a mentor. But I really want to stress that she was a gifted and really skilled artist in her own right. She was quite prolific in her lifetime. She exhibited at the Salon, which was the prestigious institution of the exhibition where artists aimed to exhibit, but not everybody was selected, but she was. She was reviewed and written about by the art critics of her time, and that was really major too, because women artists weren't even allowed access to the École des Beaux-Arts, which was again the major art academy in Paris at the time. So what women artists had to do was either be self-trained, or if they were privileged, like Eva Gonzalez was, came from a wealthy family and had the resources and connections, they would find private instruction like she did with Manet. So what do we see here in this painting? We see a woman in white seated in an interior setting. She has sort of wavy brown hair, you can see on her forehead. She has rosy cheeks, slightest hint of a smile. She's very elegant, very poised. This is very likely the artist's sister, Jeanne, who posed for her very frequently. I compared this image to known portraits of Jeanne, and they have very, very similar features. So I'm pretty confident in guessing that this is Jeanne as the model. And Jeanne, like I said, sat for most of her portraits. Jeanne was also an artist herself, who also painted Eva. So they were painting each other. Their father was Emmanuel Gonzalez, who was a Spanish playwright and a novelist. So there was an awareness and a deep-seated interest, preoccupation with the arts, literary arts, visual arts in that family. And it was supported and encouraged in the Gonzalez family from a young age. One of the characteristics of Impressionist painting is that these artists were masters of light and shadow. So they explored how colors would be affected by light that's diffused or light that is really bright, sunlit environments. Their canvases were generally very luminous. So unlike their predecessors that often primed canvases with darker colors, they would prime their canvases with really light tones. They would often use purples and greens and blues and these sort of very light sort of palette in their compositions to have the impression of light-filled canvases. So I want to draw your attention to this white dress. Now I say it's white, but if you look closely, you'll see that it's not a flat white, right? It's a very three-dimensional white that's made up of many different tones. So Jenny, if I can ask you to be my scroll here, in the upper half near her shoulders, you have these sort of grayish, lilac-y kind of undertones, a very silvery quality. So she's creating more cool toned whites. And if you kind of follow your eyes down to her skirt and her gloves, you have more creams and yellowish hues that's beautifully transitioning into warmer tones, warmer toned whites. She's also drawing out many different textures. If you just look at her attire, many different textures just through the white. So you have the silky satin, again, sheen that make up her sleeves and also the buttons on her bodice. You have white fringes and tassels on her skirt, especially sort of, at the bottom over there. There's a gauzy diaphanous fabric that's sort of draped on her arms. And I love the detail right above it, which is this like bunched up fabric at her bell sleeve because her arm is slightly bent. And again, with the sort of impressionist style, those are just really quick, rapid brush strokes that she's putting on the canvas, but she is evoking bunched up fabric, which is just beautifully done. And one of my favorite details in this painting are the sort of wispy whites of the bird feathers that's on her hat, which I think is just beautifully done, just sort of delicate, thin brush strokes. So yes, this is a portrait of a woman dressed in a white gown, but there is so much attention paid to all of the details that it becomes so much more dynamic than we might have initially perceived. Now, in the 19th century, the image of a well-dressed, very fashionable, chic, elegant, and maybe slightly aloof Parisian woman became a common symbol for the French nation, and particularly Paris, as the most modern, cosmopolitan, sophisticated, advanced city in the world. So it's almost kind of propaganda through art, but done in a kind of very subtle way. And this was known as La Parisienne, the Parisian woman. So it wasn't referring to any one particular individual, but it was a common type of cultural figure that appeared in books and art throughout. And everything from her dress that I just talked about to the corsage of violets that you see on her bust, to the white bird plumes on her, and even to that really decorative interior at the time. So Gonzalez was touching on ideas and themes that would have been instantly recognizable to her audiences. And again, that contrast between her white dress and that very decorative background was obviously very intentional by the artist to make her stand out even more. So, I mean, I think there's still a lot more work to be done on this painting, but I think it's a really stellar example of Gonzalez's whole oeuvre. She died at a really young age. She died just a couple of weeks after childbirth from an embolism at age 34. She left a lot of works, I believe around 140 something works, paintings and works on paper. So that is a real triumph for a woman artist at that time. Who doesn't necessarily have access to the art establishment, but still found her path and was able to create so much beautiful work. And it greatly enhances the 19th century art collection at NMWA. And we're just so thrilled to have this painting. But yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna say I have to brag a little bit and say that I'm lucky enough to have seen this in person. And I mean, for anyone who loves painting, anyone who's a painter themselves, the handling of paint in this image is luscious. Like, it's like frosting. It is so incredible. You want to lick it. Please don't. When you see this on view, please don't lick it. But
yeah, don't lick the painting.
That's kind of like the visceral reaction that I had to it. Seeing it in person, it's fantastic.
And you and I are very sort of, we like textured canvases. We like, that is something that we're both gravitate towards. And I think this is definitely one that's sort of a pleasure for the senses. You look at it and there's just so much to pick out. And again, very, very dynamic, because we can often get sort of bored by portraits, but the more you look at these sort of historical portraits, you see just the skill level and the mastery of artists and how they like to show those skills through all of these different textures. Again, this is not a colorful, this is a white dress, but look at how much she was able to accomplish through that.
It's really, it's like a master class in painting.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about another painting that is coming into our collection, also from the holidays. And yes, I do really like texture in painting, but because my background is 17th century Dutch, I'm also a big fan of very smoothly painted paintings, very realistic paintings. So the next one I'd like to talk about is not Dutch, it's actually Italian. Okay, here we go. And this is a work on panel, oil on panel. Oh, white, sorry. By the Italian artist Fede Galizia. I think we kind of sound like a broken record after a while when we're talking about historical women. We're like, well, we don't know a lot about them, but such is the case for historical women artists, right? Galizia was born probably around 1574 in Turin, which is in the north of Italy. And she spent most of her life in Milan, in northern Italy. And like a lot of historical women artists, she was known during her lifetime. She was talked about in contemporary sources. And was even, I think when she was 12, talked about in one of the contemporary sources, kind of praising her skill. So she was very precocious, young talent. Her father was a miniature painter, and she probably studied with him. And I think that you can see that attention to detail, right, that a miniature painter has reflected in this still life here. This is an absolutely gorgeous, vibrant still life of a bowl of cherries. And Orin talked a little bit about, the impressionist use of light and dark in the 19th century, but obviously artists going back a lot earlier were using this chiaroscuro effect to great drama in their works of art. Now, it's really interesting because Galizia was really only known or only talked about during her lifetime as a painter of large history paintings, so altarpieces, historical scenes, but also portraits. Nobody really mentioned her still life paintings. And it wasn't until the 20th century that a still life was discovered by her. And it was dated, it's not this one that we're looking at here, but another one. It was dated on the back 1602, which makes it one of the earliest Italian still life paintings. So it's really exciting because you kind of see the vagaries of an artist's reputation over the centuries and what's focused on and what's not focused on. And of course, during her lifetime, that the highest, category of painting was history painting or altar pieces, right? Because there were figures, you had to know how to render the human figure, which was thought to be, the most important subject. And still lives were not, at that time, they were kind of on the lower rung, right? Because it was thought that they were just, imitating nature. There was no invenzione, no intellectual pursuit needed on the part of the artist, which is not true at all. But I think it's really interesting that it was in the 20th century, that she became, that her still lives were kind of rediscovered and she became known. So today she's really known more for her still life paintings. So just really fascinating to see kind of what's in vogue in certain points. This is an incredible image. She's a wonderful still life painter, and she's a contemporary of another artist we have in the collection, Curators, who was living in the north, in the northern Netherlands, what is present day Belgium. And it's really pleasing for me as a curator to be able to have an example of still life from Italy during the same time period as in the north, because it really shows that women, this is a really young genre still at the beginning of the 17th century. And it shows that women, both in the South and the North, were in the genre from the get-go. And because of that, were influential on subsequent generations of artists, male artists, as well as female artists, because they were kind of paving the way. Still life was a new genre. And so they were kind of, shaping it up and setting the standards. And, just really quickly, as again, a tour de force of painting in a much different style than the Gonzalez that we just saw, you can, and I always talk about this in the Curators paintings as well, she's really showing off what she can do in paint and rendering these different surfaces. So you see the sheen on that silver, the silver compote that's holding the cherries. You can imagine touching that and it feeling cold to your touch. And then you get the ripeness of the cherries and the modulated tones of the yellows and reds of those cherries. And then the crab apples, those are actually crab apples to the right, not cherries. So she, look, I can do this fruit, but I can also do that fruit. The leaves are a little bit different. And then she's got this wonderful little butterfly on the left here that kind of enlivens this scene. So just a wonderful example of her painting. I'm so thrilled to have it in the collection. And when you, our audience who are watching, hopefully come and to our newly renovated building, keep your eye out for some of these works we're talking about today, because more likely than not, they will be up. So
my favorite detail, Ginny, is that one cherry that's sort of hanging off against that dark background. It is so masterfully done.
Yeah, and so like a snapshot. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to fall any moment. Either it's going to pull this one off with it, or it's going to break here. But yeah, just that sense of immediacy of in the moment.
Yeah, which is very pre-impressionist, I will say, because that's what Impressionism was all about, just sort of snapshots in life before the light moves. And that's what she was doing hundreds of years before those guys came along.
Yeah.
Hey, Ginny, I have a question for you from the Q&A. Someone was asking, are there hidden self-portraits in works by Fede Galizia like they are in the Peters paintings?
That's a great question. I can kind of see what led to that question, because you see these great reflections here in the silver, and very often in a number of still life paintings by Clara Pater, she reflects herself in glass, and it's kind of this this beveled surface sometimes that she's reflecting herself in. No, the answer is no, not as far as I know. I haven't come across any indication that any of Galizia's still life images kind of hold this reflected self-portrait. But great question.
Yeah, another question really quickly. Someone has asked about symbolism. We always talk about the sort of many layered understandings of symbolism within a work of art. Contemporaneous to when it was created, but also the way we read it today. So I don't know if you have any insight into that. And then do we know much about her technique? Was there glazing, or sort of how was she applying this paint to create this really sort of smooth texture to the work?
Yeah, and I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but she did use this kind of layering technique of glazing in her painting to achieve that really kind of almost three-dimensional quality of these objects. The question about symbolism is important. And again, coming from 17th century Dutch fields, people talk about that all the time. We do know that Galicia was a very devout Catholic woman, and cherries and she painted a lot of altarpieces, we know. And oftentimes in Renaissance art, different fruits and flowers had different meanings and they associated with different things. Cherries are associated with the Virgin Mary. Sometimes you'll even see Renaissance paintings of her holding a pair of cherries. Also the blood of Christ because of the red color. Even the butterfly here has been equated with kind of the human soul or the human spirit. But I think the beauty about paintings like this is that it can operate either way, depending on who's looking at it and depending on, they get out of it what they want. As to what the artist's intent was, it's a little bit hard to say. We can maybe glean some things from her personal life, but if she was painting this on commission, for someone who wasn't particularly religious, then maybe it's just a beautiful, beautiful pile of cherries. Hard to say, but thank you. So we are not only hard at work acquiring important historical works for the collection, but also contemporary works. And so we're going to fast forward a couple hundred years. And I'm going to turn it back to Orin to talk a little bit about one of those more contemporary works.
Yeah, so this is another work that we're really, really excited to bring into the collection. This is a work by Emma Amos, who was an acclaimed painter and printmaker and activist and educator. Who was active in predominantly in the New York art scene. And the reason I myself, but all the curators are so excited to have Emma Amos finally in the collection is that she was really a pioneer who confronted racism and sexism in the art world. She was born in segregated Atlanta, Georgia in the 1930s, and Addie just included a link to her bio. You went on to study art in Ohio and then in London and eventually moved to New York, where she again became active in the downtown art scene there. In 1963, she became the sole female member of Spiral, which was a short-lived but very important group of African-American artists in New York City who explored the role of Blackness in art. But her influences came from a diverse range of sources. So she was influenced by Western European art, abstract expressionism. She was very influenced by the civil rights movement and also by the feminist movements that came about in the 60s and 70s. And she once said that it's always been my contention that for me, a Black woman artist, to walk into the studio is a political act, right? So just by being an artist who also happens to be a Black woman making art, voicing herself, expressing herself, that in itself was political. And I have always loved that quote by her. And she kind of lived her career, her life by that ideology, by that philosophy. And she refused to box herself into any one particular category. So she worked at very small scales to very large paintings and prints. She had really bright, colorful canvases, but was also very innovative as a printmaker, as you can see, and also textile artist. And when she's working with textiles, and you would have heard the story before about craft being, a woman's art and not as good as painting or sculpture or drawing. So she's really, through her textile art, elevating craft to the fine arts like painting and printmaking. And her subject matter was also both abstract and figurative. So she was sort of a Jane of all trades, so to speak. And here we're seeing an example of her figurative work with Pool Lady. Amos frequently celebrated the Black body, particularly the woman's body, which was so often overlooked in visual culture and often negatively portrayed. So this is Amos's very contemporary take on the bather theme. And if you have gone to museums or gone through art history books, you would have seen that bather theme throughout the history of art. She was looking at artists like Picasso, Cezanne, and other modernists who painted scenes of female bathers. And those bathers would often be passive. They would often be nude. They may be objectified and hypersexualized. They were almost always white women, right? So she is really inserting the Black woman into this history of art by depicting a Black bather. But unlike a timeless scene, right, where we cannot pick out where and when this woman may have existed, she's bringing this image into her time, into her present era. And it is said that this is very likely a self-portrait. And here you see that she is not nude. She is wearing a bathing suit from the era. She's not passive. She has one hand on her hip, very clearly, like we can see her. And she is also, I don't think, confrontational, but she doesn't shy away from meeting our gaze directly, right? So she is looking directly back at us. I think she's very confident and self-assured, which is what Amos was trying to get to in so much of her work in celebrating the Black woman and the Black woman's body. And as so often with her work, this is a form of social commentary, which she denies and resists a lot of those cultural stereotypes that existed then and honestly exist to this day that were associated with Black femininity. And I also want to point out that her expertise and her skills as a printmaker and textile artist come through here in the way she handles the really rich tones of brown aquatint. I mean, this is not a colorful work, but it's certainly not monochromatic, as you can see the different shades of brown here. And I also love the way she creates these very contrasting textures and patterns in her bathing suit, and that I'm guessing that's a towel that her hand is resting on, and also the foliage in the background. So all of that done through printmaking, it takes a real level of skill, and it's truly a beautiful print. She died very recently. She died in 2020 at age 83. And just earlier this year, she had a retrospective at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She's been in several important group shows in recent years. And I think this recognition is obviously well-deserved, but also well overdue, like the story of so many women artists. But we're again thrilled to have an Amos work that speaks to the context of our collection and speaks to other trailblazing contemporaries like Faith Ringgold, who worked at the same time as Emma Amos, and also younger generations of provocative artists like Sonia Clarke, who Hannah will tell us a little bit more about right now. So.
Thanks, Orin. Yeah, so Jenny, if you want to scoot to the next slide here. So this is the work of Sonia Clarke that you might recognize. I'm going to speak to 3 works that are recent acquisitions.
Oh no, is Hannah frozen for anybody else?
She was, yes.
Yeah.
No.
Uh-oh.
Technical difficulties. Wait, okay. Until we get her back. Maybe Orin, could you send her a quick text? I will just. Oh, is she coming back on? There she is.
Okay, are you able to hear and see me?
Yes.
Now we are.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm not really sure what happened. Maybe a glitch in my internet, but Anyway, I'm not sure where I cut out, but I'm going to share 3 works by Sonia Clarke that were recently acquired. The museum had the opportunity to acquire 5 additional works by Sonia Clarke in the last year or so. So I'll just highlight 3 of them. Clarke is a local artist who was born and raised in DC. And if you have followed the museum's online presence over the past couple of years, or maybe if you're local to DC and have been able to visit the museum before we closed for renovations, you are likely very familiar with Clarke's work. We have exhibited her both in our collection galleries as well as the exhibition that you see an installation shot of here, which was on view just before we closed. Sonia Clarke is primarily known as a fiber artist, working with material like human hair, beads, thread, combs, and materials like that. And she applies a range of fiber art processes such as weaving, stitching, braiding to these types of materials, as well as flags, sugar, and other types of found objects. And much of her work deals with themes of ancestry, race, identity, labor, and history, both her own personal and family history, as well as collective shared histories. And her work first entered NMWA's collection in 2013. If you've had the opportunity to visit the museum, you might recognize some of her work. One example is a work called Afro Abe, which is a piece of US currency featuring Abraham Lincoln, onto which she stitched him this sort of giant in black thread, this giant afro. And so she's an artist whose work and career NMWA's curators have followed and been excited about for a very long time. And we were fortunate enough to have the opportunity to partner with Sonia Clarke on a solo survey exhibition in 2021, titled Tatter, Bristle, and Mend. And that exhibition was a wonderful opportunity to bring together works from throughout her career. So it showcased some of her earliest work with beads through to a brand new piece that made its debut in the exhibition, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we were very fortunate that after the exhibition closed, we had the opportunity to acquire some more works by the artists. So Ginny, if you can go back just one slide to the curls image. One thing that the exhibition I think really underscored was just the breadth of Sonia Clarke's work to date. So the works that were already in our collection were a lot of pieces that related to hair, either using hair as a medium or dealing with different themes surrounding it. We did have one piece made of combs. And one work that entered the collection recently is the work that you see here that was up against our title wall, titled Curls. So this is a larger comb piece, as you can see. It's stretched floor to ceiling. And a lot of the sculptures that were previously in the collection were at a smaller scale. So we were very excited to introduce something that was much larger in scale. And as you can see, like many of her larger sculptures, this one was created by fastening together hundreds of small black plastic pocket combs. So it's a little difficult to see in the image, but each section of the curl basically is made by the artist tying together small black combs that come together to create these larger than life tendrils of hair. And a lot of her work that either mimics hair or is made with hair indicates her admiration of hairdressers. She says that she sees hairdressers as fiber artists themselves, with hair being the most elemental type of fiber. And so when she first started working with the tools of hairdressing, she chose the most common, ubiquitous type of comb, one that can be found in any convenience store. And here she has fastened them together in these sort of cascading tendrils. And much of her work in which she uses these combs calls into question how this object is used and what types of hair these products are intended for. These sort of very commonly cheap, easily purchased hair tools. Which type of hair are these used for, and what texture of hair can this common comb go through? And then with this work as well, there is, of course, the irony of these very tightly coiled curls being formed from the very tool that is intended to tame them. So I think her work, sort of dives deeply into issues of race and identity and history, while also oftentimes being a little bit tongue-in-cheek as well. If you can go to the next slide. We also were fortunate enough to acquire a photograph titled Mom's Wisdom or Cotton Candy. So this is a color print. Much of Clarke's work is sculptural and three-dimensional. So it's exciting to have this two-dimensional work as well. Again, you can see clearly still dealing with the theme of hair, but also tying in family and ancestry, which are themes that are central to much of Sonia Clarke's work. You can see here, she's cradling this ball of white hair. It's actually her mother's hair. So she's very interested in how hair connects us to our ancestors and how hair carries all of our DNA. It's sort of a direct link to family members as well as further back ancestry. And then also, as the title indicates, this white fluffy hair is reminiscent of cotton candy, which also ties into some of the artist's work with sugar. That's another material that she uses. So we can skip to the next slide. And then this is another work that came into the collection recently titled Schiavo/Ciao. And this is a work in neon, which was actually a new medium for Sonia Clarke. She had not previously worked in this type of material, and the work was exhibited for the very first time in NMWA's exhibition, Tatter, Bristle, and Mend. Clarke is very interested in text and language and the root of words, and that comes into play in much of her work. So this is a great example of that. And the neon actually toggles between this word schiavo, which is the Italian word for slave, and then the word ciao, which is just kind of a common greeting that I think many people toss around very casually and are unaware of the word's roots and kind of the history of it. So with these three new acquisitions, we're really excited to, I think, bring more breadth to the examples of Sonia Clarke's work in our collection. And, you can see how they all really kind of complement each other, and the themes come together really nicely.
Thank you all so much for sharing. I just really appreciated hearing more about just a handful, as Denise said, just a few new works that have come into our collection over the last few years. I just, as a way of wrapping up, I just want to say thanks to all who joined us today, especially to Ginny, Hannah, and Orin for giving us some insight into the most recent works that have been welcomed into our collection, as well as to their particular interests and expertise in various areas of art history. We'd also welcome everyone to join us for our next episode of NMWA xChange, which is called Women Building Better, when Ginny and I will chat with three women who are deeply involved with the renovation process at NMWA's building. That episode is on Tuesday, September 13th at 12 noon Eastern, as always, and I will share a registration link with you. But thank you all so much for joining us today, and we look forward to being with you in September. Thanks, Ginny. Thanks, Orin, and thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.